Why would the Dallas Mavericks' asking price for a 32-year-old all-star suddenly drop so dramatically that rival teams are circling with renewed interest? On Wednesday, ESPN insider Shams Charania reported on NBA Countdown that the Atlanta Hawks and Toronto Raptors are the foremost teams pursuing Anthony Davis, as trade conversations have picked up around the injured Mavericks star. According to Charania, Dallas is having renewed trade talks with multiple interested teams, but the cost for acquiring Davis is most certainly going to be lower than it was even a month ago. The Mavericks had been hedging that Davis would rack up games and improve his value, pushing the price up and up. But that strategy appears to have backfired. Davis, 32 years old, is currently dealing with ligament damage in his left hand. Though he received positive news on Tuesday that he wouldn't require surgery to repair the issue. For a franchise that once viewed Davis as a cornerstone piece capable of commanding a massive haul in return, the acknowledgement that his trade value has declined represents a significant shift in leverage and expectations. And according to sources close to the situation, the path to this moment reveals far more about organizational miscalculation and internal tension than the public narrative suggests. People familiar with the matter say the Mavericks front office had been operating under a specific strategic assumption for weeks: that Davis would return to full health, string together productive performances, and gradually rebuild his trade value to the point where Dallas could command premium assets in return. According to those briefed on internal discussions, this wasn't just hopeful thinking, but an actual organizational strategy that influenced roster decisions and timeline planning. Sources say the front office had been resisting trade inquiries throughout the early portion of the season, telling interested teams that Davis's value would only increase and that they should wait. What hasn't been reported publicly, according to people close to the organization, is that this strategy created significant internal debate within the Mavericks. Sources say there was a faction within the front office that argued Dallas should have moved Davis earlier, when his perceived value was higher and before additional games created opportunities for injury or diminished performance to reduce his market worth. People familiar with these earlier discussions describe presentations, warning that waiting carried substantial risk, that every game played represented another chance for something to go wrong. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the situation, the hand injury accelerated a reckoning that some within the organization believed was inevitable. While the ligament damage didn't require surgery, and Davis avoided the worst-case scenario, sources say the injury fundamentally altered the calculus around his trade value. People familiar with the matter describe urgent meetings in the days following the injury diagnosis, with front office personnel reassessing their entire approach to the Davis situation. The decline in asking price, according to sources close to the organization, wasn't simply a reflection of the hand injury itself, but rather what the injury represented to potential trade partners. People familiar with league-wide discussions say teams that had been interested in Davis now viewed him through a different lens. A 32-year-old player whose body was showing signs of accumulated wear, whose games played this season had been limited, and whose long-term durability represented a significant question mark for any franchise considering surrendering valuable assets. What made the situation particularly frustrating for some within Dallas, according to those briefed on internal debates, was the sense that this outcome had been predictable. Sources say there were people within the organization who had advocated for trading Davis a month earlier, when his perceived value was at its peak and before the risk of injury or performance decline could materialize. People familiar with these arguments describe them as prescient in hindsight, warnings that holding out for a better price carried the risk of ending up with a worse one. According to people close to the situation, the Atlanta Hawks emerged as one of the foremost suitors because of their specific roster construction needs and timeline. Sources say Atlanta viewed Davis as someone who could address their most glaring weakness while fitting within their competitive window. People familiar with the Hawks' thinking describe internal evaluations that weighed Davis's age and injury history against his proven ability to impact winning when healthy. The lowered asking price, sources say, made the risk calculation more favorable from Atlanta's perspective. The Toronto Raptors' interest, according to those briefed on their thinking, reportedly stemmed from similar considerations, but with different organizational context. Sources say Toronto had been evaluating various paths to accelerate their rebuild and viewed Davis as a potential centerpiece who could attract additional talent and elevate the franchise's competitive standing. People familiar with the Raptors' internal discussions describe debates about whether acquiring a 32-year-old with injury concerns aligned with their stated timeline. But the reduced cost apparently made the proposition more palatable. Behind the scenes in Dallas, according to sources close to the organization, General Manager Nico Harrison found himself navigating the fallout from a strategy that hadn't played out as planned. People familiar with Harrison's position say he had genuinely believed that Davis would demonstrate enough health and productivity to justify holding out for a premium return. The reality that his value had instead declined, sources say, created pressure, both externally from rival teams sensing opportunity, and internally from those who had advocated for earlier action. What complicated the Mavericks' position, according to those briefed on the matter, was the narrow window for maximizing return value. Sources say Dallas understood that waiting too long risked further depreciation of Davis's trade worth, but moving too quickly might mean settling for less than what they could potentially extract if they negotiated strategically with multiple interested parties. People familiar with these calculations describe a front office trying to salvage the best possible outcome from a situation that had already deviated significantly from their original plan. The specific structure of potential deals, according to sources close to the discussions, reportedly became a focal point of negotiations with both Atlanta and Toronto. People familiar with preliminary conversations say Dallas was pushing for packages centered around young players and draft capital, attempting to rebuild quickly rather than taking on veteran contracts that wouldn't align with their timeline. But sources say the lowered asking price limited the Mavericks' leverage to dictate terms, forcing them to consider offers they might have dismissed a month earlier. What hasn't been discussed publicly, according to people familiar with the situation, is how Davis himself has processed the trade speculation and the acknowledged decline in his market value. Sources close to his thinking say he understands the business reality, but also believes his productivity, when healthy, justifies significant organizational investment from whichever team acquires him. People familiar with Davis's mindset describe someone focused on rehabilitation and return rather than engaging with the trade speculation swirling around him. The coaching staff's perspective, according to those briefed on their thinking, added another dimension to Dallas's internal deliberations. Sources say the coaches valued Davis's impact when available, but acknowledged the challenges of building consistent schemes and rotations around a player whose availability had been inconsistent. People familiar with coaching staff discussions describe conversations about whether the team's long-term interests were better served by moving Davis and establishing more reliable roster continuity. League-wide, according to sources familiar with broader NBA conversations, Davis's situation became a case study in the risks of trying to time the trade market. People briefed on discussions among rival front offices say several teams viewed Dallas's predicament as a cautionary tale, that holding assets in hopes of value appreciation can backfire when injuries or performance declines materialize. The lessons learned, sources say, could influence how other organizations approach similar situations with aging stars whose trade value sits in uncertain territory. What remained unclear as negotiations intensified, according to those close to the situation, was whether Dallas would ultimately accept one of the current offers or continue holding out for a better package, despite the acknowledged decline in leverage. Sources say there was ongoing internal debate about whether the Mavericks should cut their losses and move Davis quickly to avoid further value erosion, or whether patient negotiation might still extract more than the current market suggested. The medical update that Davis wouldn't require surgery, according to people familiar with the impact on trade discussions, provided some relief, but didn't fundamentally reverse the value decline. Sources say interested teams acknowledge the positive news, but remain concerned about the broader pattern of injuries and the questions about long-term durability for a 32-year-old player. People briefed on these evaluations described teams discounting Davis's value not because of any single injury, but because of what accumulated health issues suggested about future availability. Behind the scenes, according to those close to the Mavericks, there was reportedly frustration about the timing of everything, the injury happening just as Dallas was hoping to showcase Davis's value, the market response being more negative than anticipated, and the acknowledgement that their strategy of waiting had backfired. Sources describe a front office forced to recalibrate expectations and approach negotiations from a position of diminished leverage rather than the strength they had anticipated. As the February 5th trade deadline approached, the question facing Dallas became increasingly stark. Accept a reduced return now from teams like Atlanta or Toronto, or continue holding Davis and risk his value declining further. For the Mavericks, the strategic gamble they'd made weeks earlier had already produced a clear answer. Waiting hadn't worked. But whether they'd learned that lesson quickly enough to salvage meaningful value, or whether they'd wait too long again and watch the market deteriorate even more, remained to be seen. Inside the organization, sources say, no one was celebrating the position they found themselves in. If you found this breakdown insightful, take a moment to like the video. It helps this story reach more basketball fans who care about what happens beyond the box score. For more NBA stories inspired by real news, told with depth, context, and realism, subscribe to Beyond the Hardwood. And if you want to be here when the next chapter unfolds, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Let us know what you think in the comments. Was this the right move? Or is there more beneath the surface? Until next time, this is Beyond the Hardwood.